was the director of exchange programs. I'm a professor of history at
we
HBU.
tried
I'm also
doing
the
it
co-chair
then.
of the Global Issues Working Group. And this is the group that organized the Global Issues Lecture Series. This is the second lecture in the Global Issues Lecture Series. We'll have 4 more lectures. They all take place at 11:50, usually always on Wednesdays. I think there's one 2 weeks from now. 2 weeks from now, I'm going to be talking about European immigration and is this a clash of civilizations or is something else going on? This week we have, oh, and by the way, the Global Issues Working Group is a unofficial group at HPU that simply is organized around issues that we think are crucial to global society today and crucial to global citizenship. Later on in the semester, we're actually going to have a lecture on global citizenship and its meaning for you. And so I want to welcome you to the Global Issues Lecture Series. Today we have Dr. Jim Corcoran, who is a military historian and studies security issues. And Jim is going to talk to us today about Global Trends 2025. Jim?
Okay, thanks very much, John. Thanks. To begin with, anybody who still needs to fill out a card for the drawing for students, this is for students, you can, the card and pen is on the table and put them in that bowl and then we'll have a drawing at the end. What I want to do is start out by having a little shout out. And we're going to have Professor David do the reporting. And when you have your global issue for 2025, whatever you think it will be in the year 2025, whether you think it will be oil or water or poverty or war, whatever you think it will be, I want to hear from you all. And I want you all to tell me what you think the global issue is going to be. And you should also be writing it on your card. So if you win the drawing at the end, then we'll read out your global issue. So anybody who wants to begin as a global issue. Food. Food, okay. Yes.
Foreign policy?
Foreign policy.
Global warming.
Global warming, okay.
Water.
Water. We have water at the table, by the way. You guys? Okay. Next. Anybody else? Global issues for 2025.
Overpopulation.
Overpopulation, population. Yes.
Sustainable energy.
Sustainable energy. Sustainable energy. Oil. Anybody else?
The SCO.
The SCO?
Yeah. Our relations with them.
The SCO.
The Shanghai Cooperation.
Oh, the SCO, yeah, SCO is big with China, Russia, Kazakhstan, your stuff. Anybody else? You guys want to jump in? You all?
Increased use of social media technology.
Yeah, communication, social media, technology. Did you have? Okay. Yes.
Immigration?
Immigration.
Yeah,
Immigration, yeah, immigration. Okay, I think that gets us started. The idea is just to hear from you what you think these most important global issues will be. And then, of course, as I go along, you'll be able to kind of compare. Now, to begin with, this study is done by the National Intelligence Council, which is a part of the Director of National Intelligence in Washington, D.C., and the DNI actually oversees all of the 20-some intelligence agencies, intel agencies, throughout the federal government. So it's a very important study, and what this study does is it assesses trends which are in place today, such as population, such as energy, and then it by applying heavy computerized data and heavy statistical data, it tries to project each of those trends. It could be population, as you all mentioned, it could be energy, out into the year 2025. And the interesting thing is that as we talk right now, that The new study for 2030 is underway in the National Intelligence Council. And so it will be good for you to hear about this study because it will prepare you for the new studies which will be coming out. Global Trends 2030, and that will be coming out toward the end of this year. So we're right on the cusp of what we want to do. So the first thing I want to introduce myself. I'm Professor Jim Corcoran. I teach for the Military Campus Program, and I teach International Studies Asia, and I teach military, U.S. diplomatic history, American history, and world history, and those kinds of courses. First of all, to let you know my heart is in the right place, I wore my green shirt today, so I have my green shirt. If you'll notice, it's almost all cotton. It's hard to get 100% cotton, but very little synthetic in it. And notice the colors, and if you notice the logo for our Global Issues Work Group, it's the brown tree with the green leaves, and so that represents that. Another thing is, 2 weeks ago, I was at the Hawaii Wholesalers and Trade Tourism Association meeting, and there was a businessman visiting from China, and I handed out some of these flyers, and when he got the flyer, he turned to me and said, "Oh, you're going to tell our fortune at 2025. Well, no, this is not fortune telling. This is all based on sound, empirical data, which is thrown into supercomputers, and there's a handout which will be coming around to you, which will show you all of the different agencies. 30 and 40 agencies around the world have been tapped by the National Intelligence Council in order to bring all this information together in a study which is really over 120 pages. I'll start this around, and you can look at the animal itself that we're talking about and have an idea of what I'm talking about. So the idea is, no, this is not fortune telling. This is actually an empirical study with a lot of good information in it. However, if you want, I will tell you fortunes. And so if you meet me outside afterwards for a fee, I'll be very happy to tell you fortunes. So, and then as I was going over my computer this morning before coming in, and I clicked on the news, and the headline was, "Crocodile Gets Loose on Qantas Airlines Flight." I thought, whoa, what an image. Can you imagine a crocodile gets loose? And what I want to tell you is between now and 2025, there will be those kinds of incidents. You need to just get used to it. Just hope that we're not involved in a crocodile on airplane type of situation. So to begin with, I want to kind of, seeing as I'm a historian, I want to kind of look at history and give you a little bit of a background. For any of you who are in Professor R. Watley's courses, you will recognize, for example, Lester Brown's Outgrowing the Earth, which really lights up what you all have put up on the board up there as far as food and sustainability. And then also Richard Heinberg's The End of Growth, which is more of an economic study, and it really explains how we got into this great economic recession, the worst economic crisis since the last great economic depression in the 1930s, and kind of shows what we need to do to move forward in the future. And then you have a very good study by the British Ministry of National Defense, Global Strategic Trends out to 2040. This is an excellent study, and it's a little bit more limited in scope than the one we're talking about today. And one of the reasons is it's oriented toward defense and security. And of course, our study covers all aspects of looking at the future. For any of those you who are in diplomacy and military studies, though, this is an excellent source, or if you're in international studies, international relations, this is an excellent source. And then we have the UN economic program, the GEO4, which is a very comprehensive study on the future into, as we look at ecology and environment, farming and those sorts of things. And you should also know that GEO5 is in process right now, so it will be coming out soon. So I think these, and there are other studies, but if we look at history, it's also important to notice that we've been told about many of these things some years ago. When I came back from the Vietnam War, and I was in the 1st Infantry Division, and I remember I was in the military terminal at Hickam Air Force Base, and I picked up Alvin Toffler's Future Shock. And this was in 1970. And as I got into that, I said, wow, this really pulls up the blinds all around, you know, as I look out and see there's more to life than just this war that is going on. And also there's more to life than the tremendous turbulence that we had in the United States during those years. Campus sit-ins, and the inner cities were burning, and we had, as you know, all kinds of Vietnam War protests, and Martin Luther King was assassinated, and Robert F. Kennedy. So all of this was going on at the same time, and you read Future Shock, and it helped explain a lot of what was going on. But I think Alvin Toffler wasn't happy with the response that he got, so he came out in the 1980s with the 3rd wave, which went further into explaining the things he was trying to tell us. Many of the things that are in our study today, but we've taken it further. And then, very interesting, by the Council on Foreign Relations, toward the year 2018, and that was done in 1970, as I remember, toward the year 2018, and it talks about population, it talks about energy, it talks about nuclear proliferation, all these sorts of things. And so it's a comprehensive book for its time. What I want to say about all 3 of these resources coming from history is they are all BC, before computers, that is. And so one can really tell what the difference is when one goes from these to the study that we have here today. You can really tell the difference, that we can go so much broader and so much deeper in our analysis with the tremendous lift that ICT, Internet Communication Technology, has provided us. So this is a very, very important thing. So I just want to cover those things. Now, to begin with, what this study does is a number of things. The purpose of the study, of course, is to identify key trends and the factors that drive these trends, where they seem to be headed, and how these trends might interact with each other. In addition to that, the idea is to look at issues such as globalization, demography, the rise of new powers, economics, decay of international institutions, which is very important, climate change, and so on. So examine the interaction of those trends, how they will affect each other. And then also recognize that we have to help identify opportunities for policy intervention. That's a very, very key thing, to know not only what is coming up and what is going to happen, but what kind of policies can we create in order to deal with those things. So that's the purpose of this lengthy study. The message in this study, very important, of course, always good leadership can mean the difference between success and failure. So good leadership is very important. In addition, you should know that any of these trends can change or can be changed. So this is very important. None of these trends are immutable. They can all change and be changed. And so, of course, by doing that, we would count on our government and in conjunction with other governments and world participation in order to intervene and decrease the severity of any of these events that we think are coming in the future. So that's the message. One of the important things that this study tells you is that the international system by 2025 will be almost unrecognizable. And you're sitting here saying, well, gee, how can that be? Because 2025 isn't that far off. But if you think back 13 to 15 years in our past, you can see how things have changed, especially in communications technology. I mean, it's just been like an explosion, which is still going on right now. Some of these things that will be occurring, the rise of Emerging powers, if you haven't heard of the BRIC, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, they are rising. All of them have effectively moved into the top 10 economies of the world, and I'll talk a little about the growing military power. And a globalizing economy, and what's important here, we see the competition right now between Japan and China. China, the #2 economy in the world, Japan, the #3 economy in the world, over in the Senkaku Diaoyutai Islands in the East China Sea. And you say, well, this is a clash out on those islands, but the fact is that Japan is China's #3 trade partner, and China is Japan's #1 trade partner, and we're talking about well over hundreds of billions of dollars in trade each year. And so how will this competition over these islands affect the economy? It's already affecting it because of the nationalist resistance in China against Japan for these islands. Then Japan has had to close down many of its businesses in China and even draw some of them out. So it's already affecting the economy between the two. And with the economy between those two being affected, you see that has a ripple effect around the world. As their economies are affected, our economy, European economy, others are affected also. So this is the idea of the globalizing economy, which I think we need to look at very close. The center of gravity of world finance and economics has moved offshore from the West, which is basically Europe and the Americas, over toward Asia. And we can say now, for example, in Asia, China, the #2 world economic power, Japan, the #3 world economic power. India, for example, is in the top 10, so all of these. So we see that center of gravity, the economic finance center of gravity moving. Non-state actors, a very, very important thing that is found and is really described in this study. Non-state actors that you see up here, businesses and NGOs and others, these non-state actors are accruing increasing power and influence. And one of the reasons is because states, organized states that exist now, are losing some of their power, and organized institutions such as World Bank and WTO, IMF, and these others are losing some of their power, so these non-state actors are gaining more power. The graying of populations is something many should be thinking about, but I don't think are exactly. Japan really is facing a serious situation with older, I'm in favor of older generations, don't get me wrong, but the issue we're saying here is as you get at top of that demographic chart, as it grows bigger with more aged people, then the younger people have to support the old age people. So work hard, study, get a good job. So, no, I'm really kidding. So aging population is very, very important, and that will have a lot to do with migration, and it will also have a lot to do with the effectiveness of economies in the nations. And many of you have already hit upon this, and we know that there will be a great increasing pressure on all of these issues as the supply rushes to keep up with the increased demand. That will really be the big issue that we're going to be facing during the next 15 or 20 years. And you also spotted climate change, which is great. And the immediate effect, of course, is that it can affect farming, so you have lower production. So just at the time we need a greater demand for food, we have lower production brought about by climate change. And it can also, of course, affect economies. So all of these things are very important. What we find is we're moving from basically, we couldn't call it a unipolar world, but with America as the only superpower during the past 15 years or so. Now what we're seeing is as China grows in its power and influence, India grows, as Russia grows in power and influence, then you have other poles in the world, and so everything is going to be changed as a result of that. More nations, more power and influence. As far as America is concerned, the U.S. is likely to remain the single most powerful actor. Its relative strength, even in the military realm, however, will decline. Relative strength, meaning its strength relative to these other polar nations that I just mentioned. And U.S. leverage will be more constrained. And specifically, what I put up here just to show this. This, of course, is one of the Occupy movements that took place, and you can see that within our society we have the 99%, the Occupy movements, and other societal disruptions and upsets that are going to grow. And in the political and governmental field, of course, we have to wait and see how this is all going to play out as far as governmental control and governmental control facing these issues. And then, of course, America still, by most authoritative sources, is ranked as the #1 military in the world. On the other hand, in Russia, China, as we talk about China, it's poised to have more impact on the world over the next 20 years than any other country. That's a very important finding by this study. Poised to have more impact on the world over the next 20 years than any other country. It's already the second largest economy, as I mentioned, and its military power is growing. You do see great discontent, as I show up here in the picture. There's rising nationalism, but there's discontent throughout China, especially with the huge gap between the haves and the have-nots. And a lot of people are feeling disenfranchised, and it's showing in some of the turbulence and some of the kinds of civil conflicts that we see all around China today. Then we have to question the leadership itself. Basically, that's a picture of the Standing Committee of the Politburo of the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party, and their big task right now is how do we hang on to this power? How do we run this, the most populous nation in the world, 1.5 billion people, second largest economy? How do we keep on top of that? A great challenge, and of course the militarization of China we see is increasing as they've gotten increasingly wealthy with over 10% economic growth rate for the past 20 years. A lot of that now has gone into military, and we see China asserting itself over the South China Sea and the East China Sea, the islands I just mentioned, and more of this is coming up. So we can say that's the situation in China. In Russia, I put some of the just shots of some of the discontent that is being shown, especially over the most recent elections of a cold warrior, Vladimir Putin. I found a picture of him as a KGB, which is the equivalent of US CIA, and he was the director of intelligence collection for KGB from 1976 to 1990. He's been ruling Russia for many years now, even though he might have not been in the presidential slot. His stance is still ruling, and of course now he's back in. So what does that mean for the coming decade, and how will that work out? And then of course here, what we see, actually we need to pay more attention, I think, to the rising military power of Russia that puts more resources into their military. So as it spins out today, most authoritative sources say America is the number one most powerful military, that Russia is the #2 most powerful military, and China is the #3 most powerful military in the world. And you may be interested, India is rated as the 4th most powerful military. So I think a look at these things very, very important. As the study says, this is a story with no clear outcome. And it says that no other countries are expected to rise to the level of power and influence of these three countries here. But by 2025, there will be other nations, some of which are listed here, especially Indonesia and Turkey, which will gain more, increasing power and influence. So you have an even more multipolar situation which will arise. Now, however, these countries will be doing state capitalism, and I call those command economies. And the developed nations in Europe and the United States, in order for us to implement an economic policy or program, we have to do a lot of coordination and engagement. We have two sides of the aisle in Congress. We have corporations involved. Everybody gets to play in whatever the economic program or policy is going to be. It's a very cumbersome process I like it, but it's a very cumbersome process, and it puts us at a disadvantage of these other nations, especially Russia, India, and China, who have command economies. In other words, the people leading the nation say, this is the program we're going to put into effect, do it now, and it gets done. And so for up to 2025, we're going to be hard-pressed to compete with these command economies. And I think that needs to be paid a lot of attention. The new transnational agenda across nations. First of all, of course, we will be moving away from oil, but we will be moving toward natural gas and toward coal. And so the degree to which we'll be doing that is actually very questionable. So I'd like to start a handout around which I'll be using a little later on, and it has some of the information that we're talking about. If you take one and pass it around, please. This, I think, folks, is something that we really need to be thinking about, and it's very, very important. That the demand for food will rise by 50% in the next 15-some years. 50%. How are we going to produce 50% more food in the next 10 to 15 years than we are producing now? And what is going to happen when we're not able to produce this 50% more food? What are going to be the results? There's going to be food scarcity, and how is that going to play out in our addressing of these problems? Also, if you look, stable supplies of water are critical, and what this study says, very importantly, is that by 2025, the competition over water could be more fierce than the competition over oil. The competition over water could be more fierce than the competition over oil. You know, we can really get along with less oil, or if we need to, really with no oil, but try getting along without water. Very, very important. And then this is a blockbuster. By 2030, we'll add 1.2 billion people. And of course, the things above that are all affected by this huge increase in population, adding 1.2 billion people. There's, as I remember, a little over 7 billion people on the planet today, and in the next 10 to 15 years, we're going to add another 1.2 billion. So you can imagine the stress that is going to be exerted on the global system. There will be new technologies, and one thing I should point out is that all current technologies, however, are inadequate for replacing the traditional energy architecture on the scale needed. New energy technologies probably won't be commercially available and widespread until 2025. If you look on the handout, at the very last page of the handout I gave you, if you look at that chart on the very last page, which actually charts this out, what you see here, importantly, is by 2030, the ratio of energy sources will be the same ratio that we're using today. Many of you may have thought, well, you know, we're going to have the alternative energy, and it's really going to allow us to cut back on the use, especially of oil and coal. Look at this chart. This is not the case. This is one of my most important messages today. And not only will the ratio remain the same, but the quantities will greatly increase. So we're going to be using more oil. We're going to be using more coal. And we're already grappling with how this is affecting climate change, one of the things that you all put up on the board here. This is a very important chart and a very important message from my talk, and needs to be addressed. And one of the issues is that all current technologies, a recent study found that in the energy sector, that production technology, a new production technology takes an average of 25 years for it to be put into effect. So even if we have adequate solar technology today, it will still be another 25 years before it's put into wide use, before it's manufactured and put into wide use. And that helps explain this chart, because you might ask, gee, well, I thought we were cutting back on the use of oil. I thought we were cutting back on the use of coal, and what's the story? In the case of nuclear, you'll see on your chart there's really no significant increase. A lot of people were counting on nuclear. The last I heard, the parliament in Japan has passed a law that Japan will phase out all nuclear use by 2030. And Japan today depends, or up until Fukushima last year, was depending on about 20% of its energy supply was coming from nuclear. And now, so that chart, that part of your graph is going to even decline more. Terrorism, conflict, and proliferation needs to be addressed. And interesting, what it says is that, first of all, it's likely to be less widespread, but that is dependent on what happens in the Middle East. And if the Middle East can somehow provide more jobs and more opportunity and more hope to the younger generations, then if that happens, then the idea of terrorism being less likely is in place. However, we should think about that one of the big things that we're talking about here is the diffusion of technologies and scientific knowledge. The diffusion of technologies and scientific knowledge will place more deadly weapons in the hands of terrorist groups. And so we have to take that into consideration. There are factors which affect conflict, as long as we're talking about this. First of all, we see that in Syria today and earlier in Libya, Egypt, and others, regimes will fall. There is the instability that goes along with that. And I already mentioned competition over resources as demand increases and supplies lessen, more competition for coal, for natural gas, and for oil especially. And then also that will result in the buildup of naval capabilities. In other words, these key users, especially Russia, China, and India, in order to ensure their energy supply, will have to protect their sea lanes of communication. All of that energy comes across the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea, and all of that has to be protected. So what we see now is a growing naval capability in Russia, in China, and in India. And the degree to which then that will counteract what we're trying to do as far as international security is concerned is very important. Nuclear weapons, of course, I think most of you would be familiar with the fact that, for example, today, Pakistan and India, two nuclear-capable states that have a continuing conflict between them. They've had 3 wars since 1947, and what will happen in that case. So I think those factors affecting conflict are very important. There will be greater Asian regionalism, and this will very possibly result or be the beginning of a situation where we have 3 huge blocks. There will be financial, economic, political blocks, of course, in Asia, in the Americas, and in Europe. And how that will change the scene the global scene that we're dealing with is very important. But also, we already mentioned that there will be new global players, not just Brazil, Russia, India, and China coming on very strongly, but also other nations in other areas. Again, I mentioned that international institutions are losing some of their clout for a lot of reasons. Competition with the non-state actors is one of the big reasons. And then the expansion of regional blocks and the fact that these non-state actors will become increasingly powerful. They will be able to gain more resources in order to carry out what they want to do. And then a little bit more on the BRIC nations, that first of all, one of the key things about the BRIC nations is whether or not they're going to abide by international standards and international agreements, whether they don't feel really pressured to do that, and whether or not they're going to adopt rule of law. Rule of law is extremely important, but in Russia and in China, rule of law really does cause issues. And then also whether or not they they want to decline participation in resolving these global issues, especially terrorism, climate change, proliferation. If they want to decline participating in those, they will be free to do so. So what that means is we come up to the question of what kind of a future are we going to have? Of course, no, I've already done this, sorry. First of all, the United States will be less dominant. As I mentioned, one of a number of important actors, and still the most powerful, however, at that time, but it will be less dominant. We can already see how in the Middle East, nations turn to the United States. In Asia, nations, especially Southeast Asia, nations turn to the United States in order to offset our competitive powers. And no matter what, we're going to have to take into consideration in our policy development the things that China and Russia are doing. So even in the military realm, what we're going to see is, of course, advances in science and technology. The thing about globalization is that science and technology just disperses around the world so that smaller nations, smaller militaries can gain this science and technology. And and also the growing use of cyber warfare attacks, very, very important. You may or may not know that there's a tremendous effort going on in the United States and in China especially, but also in other nations, dealing with this idea of cyber. The fact is that the most powerful nation in the world militarily can actually be left dead in the water, dead in the ground, and dead in the air by an effective cyber attack. No matter how powerful your military weaponry is, if you can take care of the issue of satellite communication, where you can't communicate with your forces, you can't locate your forces, then you're dead in the water. So again, the question is what kind of future? I bring to your attention, I'm not saying I'm warning you, but I'm bringing to your attention for the next 10 or 15 years, expect major discontinuity shocks and surprises. Be ready, there will be shocks. I mean, 9/11 was a terrific shock. You know, this is the kind of thing that you should kind of mentally, psychologically be prepared for. Whether or not we are able to transition to non-fuel fossil energy within this time period. If it happens sooner, that'll be great. If it happens later, then it puts us in more of a bind than we project. And now I've added to these nuclear use and pandemic, I've added natural disasters. And it's interesting that the study doesn't really address natural disasters, but I'm thinking of the tsunami, the great tsunami in Asia, in the Indian Ocean in December of 2004, killing hundreds of thousands, and then with all of the property damage that was done, and also, of course, last year's Fukushima. And it's interesting that the study doesn't really address those, doesn't include those, some of these things that will happen. And we've already seen, for example, the fall of some of the nations in the Middle East as a result of this Arab Spring, and the chances of this happening in other parts of the world seem to be quite good. Many think about oil and they think about the rising price of a barrel of oil, but what happens if, for whatever reason, the price of oil plunges? If the price of oil plunges, for example, in the study it says if it gets down to $50 to $70 a barrel, then Russia will be put in a very, very tough position, because Russia's economy is basically dependent upon oil and natural gas sales. Although democratization will be less prevalent, and we already see this, that it will be less prevalent in this time period, the study does say that they estimate in the long range, which will be out past 20 and 30 years, there's a chance that democratization will catch on again, and that people will go for that more than they are now. I've already mentioned command economies. Some call it state capitalism, and here we talk about state economies, but they'll be more prevalent. Now, here's what's important about that. the fact is that some of these countries which are emerging now, especially in Latin America and Southeast Asia, and even in Africa and Eastern Europe, as they look out there and they look for a model for their economic development and rise, they would see that in the past 50 years, places like South Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore achieved their great effectiveness economically by using this command economy model. See, where the government directs the programs and the policies that will be carried out, subsidizes the corporations that are carrying them out, subsidizes manufacturing, distribution, and sales. So this will be more prevalent as time goes on. And we talked about the graying of population, but also the 1.2 billion people or so added in the next 10 to 15 years, but also immigration, very, very important. Migration and immigration, very important. And the way these trends fit in together, if climate change results in lower crop production, then those people from those lower crop production areas are going to be migrating to other places. As there's more graying in Japan, Japan is being forced now to do something that they are very much basically against. That is bringing in others from other countries in order to provide the labor that they need. And the Gastarbeiter system in Germany is under severe strain. Gastarbeiter, guesswork, that they have to bring in order to make up for the need for increased labor sources. Now, so when we talk about global governance, I should bring to your attention this is not global government. Not global government, new world order. What this means, global governance means that nations come together in order to address international problems and international systems and resolve them. That's what it means. We're almost done, by the way. We know that the potential for conflict, as I've already mentioned, is going to grow. Whether or not the terrorists between now and 2025 will use nuclear weapons of mass destruction remains to be seen, and we need to work to prevent it. And of course, the same with nuclear arms races. These and more could threaten globalization. That's the point. Globalization could be very much threatened by globalization itself. And so that's the end of my talk, or is it the beginning? Thank you very much. So with the time remaining, if we have questions or discussions, if any of you need to leave soon, let me know. We should have the drawing before you leave. But in the meantime, if you have questions or points you want to make, please bring them.
Professor, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, I just read that China is now going to price oil by the UN rather than the US dollar, and the last time we saw that happen was Saddam Hussein and shortly after we invaded Iraq, for other reasons ostensibly, but that possibly being a motivator, and you see China buying up every single piece in the Arctic, Africa, wherever it is. There's natural resources, which are really our new gold standard. I wonder if you could talk about the United States' role in trade, possibly military, in regards to that.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for coming, Linda.
Yeah, no worries.
Thanks for attending.
Yeah.
Great. This is exactly what the study is talking about, and we're seeing a lot of the things. This study was done in 2008, okay? And a lot of the things that this study actually is talking about, and this is one of them, China's almost frenetic activity, especially in Latin America and in Central Asia, especially going after resources. For example, the U.S. Department of Defense did a study that found really significant mineral resources in Afghanistan, strategic metals and things. And within 2 weeks of that study being made public, China had already closed a deal with the Karzai government for $1 billion for access to those strategic materials. So this is exactly the kind of thing that we're talking about, the competition over resources and the increased power of, especially of the BRIC nations. China is a very good example of that. Does that
It does, yeah. I just wonder how you see U.S. playing a role, because of course we're trying to, WTO is having little, if any, effect sanction-wise, right? And the U.S. really can't do anything because of our economic partnership with China and the fact that they own probably a considerable amount of our debt and probably everybody's pension sitting in this room, right? So I just think, what can we really do? They have veto power in the U.S. Like, what can we really do from a sanction standpoint? Obviously, we're not going to get into military conflict with them, So I wonder what the U.S. can do other than trying to, because we're not, like you said, we're not able to compete with them, right? We don't have this kind of system where the government can say, this is what we're doing, and we do it, right? We can't go to Africa and say, here's $100 billion in trade. So I wonder what the U.S. can really do in this scenario.
Sure, John.
So if I can just take a stab at some of that, I'm John David and professor at HBU. And so the thing about China is that China's actually quite dependent upon the U.S. dollar. So I doubt that this denominating their oil production in the yuan is going to work. I don't think it's going to work. It's a global oil market, and so that's not going to work. The other thing is we have to be careful about kind of putting a halo over China, because China's got a lot of problems. I mean, they have problems that are every bit as big as their economy. It's in a huge economy. They have a tremendous kind of migration issue of people from the rural areas moving to cities and trying to find jobs and ending up at the very bottom of the economy. I would say actually the next 10 years are going to be a very difficult time for China, because they've got, there's a lot of kind of pent-up energy in the middle classes in terms of their desire for more voice in the economy and in the politics. And they're going to have, the Chinese leadership is going to have to figure out a way to mediate those voices in the middle class. The middle class now has some clout because they have a lot of economic power. And so China's going to have to find a way to mediate. There's a really good article in Sunday's New York Times by Thomas Friedman, who was just in China, on this very issue. And I think he gives a pretty balanced presentation of the kind of the China problems and what the future of China looks like.
Good questions.
Yeah, I was curious. I mean, I was just almost at a class with Dr. Chad. I'm a kind of a senior C student. So
Oh, good. I'm in favor of that.
enjoy those things. And he had like a model that out of this professor at the University of Denver. So this is probably something else. It's probably not accessible to the public, these models. But has this, I mean, this is like, okay, is this the first type of report we've had? Have we had previous reports? And how well have they reflected reality?
Yes, thank you very much. It's very important. This is the fourth iteration of this report. And so they're now engaged on their fifth iteration.
Yeah.
And in the case of the report I showed you from the British Ministry of National Defense, that's their fourth iteration also. And if you do it in the short years, like the last one of these studies was done in 2008, so that's only been 4 years, so it's a little difficult. But as I already mentioned in response to the first question, we already see some of these changes taking place. So I think the beauty of this is, compared to when I first picked up Alvin Toffler's Future Shock, and I was reading it, the beauty of it is that since then we have actually constructed formal organizations whose job is to address these issues. And the DNI, National Intelligence Council, is one of those. In other words, we've given them the resources, we've given them the personnel and the opportunity to do these studies to address these issues. So when this next one comes out, which will be Global Trends 2030, it will be briefed to the new president, whoever the new president is, when he comes into office. And so that means that, top leadership will be advised of all of this information, and they can then tailor their programs and their departments and agencies in order to begin to deal with these.
Now, did the first report have any idea that we were going to have this global slowdown and crisis and all that kind of stuff?
To tell you the truth, I've not really studied the first report, which came out in the late 90s, and I haven't really studied it in too much detail. But on some of the later reports, I've been into those as part of preparing for this. And I think I mean, like I say, in a period of 4 or 5 years, and they're done every 4 or 5 years, it's hard to get a real good bead on, you know, is this coming true or not?
Right,
You know? The big thing is, really, what we're doing here is very, very important, educating ourselves on these issues. And if we educate ourselves on these issues, then, you know, we can begin to have influence on others in order to address these issues successfully. Thank you for your question. Yes.
So demographically, just quickly, you know, it's China, of course, and Russia are supposed to be ascendant powers, but of course Russia's been having a declining population for decades, and China, of course, is facing the you know, graying on a mass scale because of the one-child policy since '89. So with, you know, there's, you know, you have the picture with the pyramid, and there's going to be a big bunch of people that are graying and a much smaller group of people to support them. So, and given the buildup of military, do you, there's going to be more military conflict, but does it seem like that there's going to be an expiration date, maybe, on, or, you know, by which they need to project their power and take territories and take, say, people to try to integrate into the countries before the demographic time bomb hits, and before they can make big power grabs like that? And, you know, also supposedly aircraft carriers, or, you know, over the next few decades, are going to be unable to work because the anti-aircraft carrier capabilities are going to reduce force projection. So it just seems like there's a number of trends that are going to absolutely require military conflict in a quick time frame before all these things hit.
Bingo. Yeah, you hit right on there. The first thing is that this study projects that there will be no major conventional war out to 2025. We're talking a war like World War II,
Right.
That kind of a war. So there won't be for a lot of different reasons. But and the other thing you bring up is very, very important. And I'm having this discussion with my military-oriented colleagues. Just as the battleship became obsolete in the Battle of Midway in June of 1942, will the aircraft carrier become obsolete in the next battle coming up, especially now that the Chinese have developed the surface-to-surface capability to do over-the-horizon destruction of naval vessels. So you know, this is a very, very important question. What we see, however, is in the case of China, growing its Navy as it is, basically to exert its power and influence over the South China Sea. And that is mainly directed toward protecting, it's at 80% of China's energy comes across that South China Sea, most of it coming out of the Middle East. And so if you want to really cripple China with one blow, you cut off that supply of energy. And the estimates are they're good for about 2 weeks, and then everything stops. So that's very, very important. Now, India is looking at that, and India is really moving very heavily. India last year was the largest arms purchaser in the world. They put more money into arms purchases than any other nation in the world. And so India is growing its Navy in the same way. So, you know, the chances are, but I think what we're looking at is we're looking at the possibility of regional conflict within regions and not across regions. I think that's what we're looking at. Very difficult to answer your question on that. Excellent question, too. Other questions?
What is your estimations for 2030? What differences?
Yeah, this is very, very important. I've been in touch with sources in Washington, D.C. This is a very important question. And what they're finding is they think that the power and capability of America will be even lower, much lower, than what's been predicted here in 2025 for a lot of different reasons. And there's a conflict going on between these different agencies as they meet and they have their seminars. And some people have really gotten torn up by being too optimistic about the continuing power and influence of America up to 2030. So that's a very, very important question. As usual, slice the melon open so we can say thanks very much to you. Yes.
I think it seems like people would want to do something about that, right? Because usually nation states don't want to give up power.
I noticed that.
On that. But I was really intrigued because the UN was formed partly to, well, not the UN, but the European Union community was set up so that we would trade between the nations to protect peace. And it just seems like it's not quite the same situation between China and Japan, but there was all this trade, and you think that would be a buffer against hostilities, but it doesn't seem to be. You were talking about Japan and then Canada.
That's very important. It's so hard to figure these things out too. This is why we really need a lot of brain power, a lot of computer power to figure this out. But the idea of what's going, the competition, the conflict between China and Japan are each other's major trade partners. I mean, dependently, 2 and 1, like that. And it's already, this competition, which is really, in my mind, is really a clash of rising nationalism. The nationalism of Japan, the nationalism of China. You see where the Chinese are saying, hey, Japan, you've done this before, you can't have any of our islands. And Japan is saying, hey, these are our islands, this is our sovereign territory. You see, and people are demonstrating, people are out in the streets. You see, both the effect that it's having is already having the effect on its economy, where Japanese businesses, having been assaulted by nationalist inspired groups in China, they've had to close up their businesses, some of them having to withdraw the business, so it's already affecting. So that's what you bring out, and this, I think, probably, maybe have time, this will have to be the last question. What you bring out is very important because what it means, it shows the interdependence of all of these different trends. That's what's really important.
Yeah.
What I would like to do before you leave is go ahead and have the drawing. So could I have you maybe choose?
First, let's give Jim a big hand for
Oh,
his
okay. Very patient. Can I have these? You don't mind? I'll hold it up so you can see. And you read out the name and the issue, the major issue.
Tony
Bamboozle?
then foreign policy.
First one. Okay, foreign policy. Thank you very much.